My apologies, Great One. I did not give my name for several reasons. I am no Magos. I am but a messenger. I am so below a masterful creation like my lord, made by the very hands of the Omnissiah himself, that my name seems meaningless. You are an exquisite and important component of the machine god's great work, a mechanism divine. I am nothing. But you ask my name, and in good faith I shall provide it. I am ck3, assistant, companion, and servant to his most glorious prime conduit of the Omnissiah, the Archmagos Belisarius' call. He bowed again. Messenius could not resist a glance at the Primarch then. Guilliman's expression had not changed, but he wondered how the Lord of Ultramar felt at being addressed as a particularly holy artifact.
"Then you are welcome, ck3, said Rabute Guilliman. "Now, if it pleases you, deliver your message."
ck3 stood. Like a man announcing drinks were available in the drawing-room, he gave a cheerful smile and clapped his primary hands together. They rang silverly. I am honoured that you receive me, my lord. Nothing would give me greater pleasure. The message follows. The Archmagos announces that his great labour of 10,000 years is done. The mission you tasked him with was arduous and complex, but he rose to the challenge and, employing all the arts the machine god saw fit to bestow upon him, he has exceeded your requirements in every way. He invites you to view the fruits of his labours in 3 days upon the Arc Mechanicus Zar Quasitor. ck3 turned slowly, addressing all the assembled dignitaries. Messenius realized that Guilliman had assembled the court not only because he wished to give a show of force to Call's faction, but because he was revealing something to his own people. The Primarch already knew what was happening. This wasn't a message for Guilliman, but for terror. Rejoice, my lords and ladies, said ck3. The salvation of the Imperium of Man is at hand. Chapter 6. The St. Aster, Reaver Fleet, Uncommon Manoeuvres. The command deck of the St. Aster shook with a dozen closely spaced impacts. Alarms wailed from every control station. Incendum suppression teams raced across the polished floor to tame a blaze threatening to roast a servitor clade in its sockets. Commodore Eloise Athergay turned around sharply in her throne to shout down at Void Shield Command, bypassing the lieutenant responsible for conveying her orders to the Master Scutum. For the last time, Scutum Control, get me my Void Shield stabilized. That was a big hit, Madam Shipmaster, said her first lieutenant. We should abort the attack run. This is an unwise course of action. Enough, Finula, Athergay growled. It is my duty to question you, my lady, First Lieutenant Finula Diomed replied. She released her grip on the railing of the command dais and looked up to the podium summit where Athergay was enthroned. The Commodore's seat was perched atop 6 steep steps. Around the periphery of the dais were 9 stations, each manned by her chief lieutenants. Athergay favoured an unusual command configuration. Void shield reignition achieved, my lady, reported her Master Scutum. Red Gift continues pursuit, said Finula. Ignore it, said Athergay. Ars Bellus and the Faith's Promise can deal with it. Maintain course. Give me the range to principal target. 1,700 miles and closing, Finula responded. The cathedral space of the command deck was a racket of noise generated by 500 people, machines, servitors, the bombardment the St. Aster was receiving, and the return fire of her guns. Athergay kept her eyes fixed on the main hololith, whose 3D display of the battlesphere showed what transpired on the other side of the fortress walls of the Grand Cruiser. Good. That's too close, said Finula. Recommend course adjustment to parallel line and immediate retaliation with port batteries. Keep them at arm's length. Stop them boarding us. If they've heretic Astartes aboard, we'll not weather the fight. Athergay glanced down. Finula thought her commander a fierce-looking woman with a prominent, sharp chin and a high, thin forehead. She habitually striped her long black hair with brilliant magenta. If this was meant to soften her, it did not work, being a single jarring flamboyance in her otherwise severe dress and manner. She wore her monocular data feed so much most people took it for an augmetic, and a haptic glove with input wands attached to the fingers of her right hand, which made it look like a claw. Finula, I truly believe the spirit of caution crawled in your ear and took up residence. You are too timid. Advice heard and disregarded. These blood god-worshipping bastards like it close, so let's give it to them. We're going to drive at them and shove the Emperor's judgment down their throats before they can get their twisted backsides into their boarding craft. On the hololith, the main enemy vessel was displayed as a large Truepict. Its designation was Sword of Brass, and it was bearing down aggressively on the image of their own ship. Though a crowd of floating data tags crowded the hull, showing the damage the Sword of Brass had already taken in the battle, it had yet to have its teeth pulled. The ship was of comparable size and power to the St. Aster, and capable of taking much more of a beating than it had already sustained. Athagay refused to close the oculus shutters, and so they could also see the Sword of Brass with their own eyes, separated from them by a vanishingly short stretch of void. Whichever Forge World had built the Sword of Brass would no longer recognize it. The full front fifth was dominated by a gargantuan white skull, so realistically contrived, Finula half believed it to be the massive brain case of a defeated god. 3 enormous cannons protruded from its eye sockets and open-hinged jaw. Behind the skull, a collection of crenellations and flying buttresses hinted at its imperial origins, though all were crusted in baroque skulls and twisted brass sculptures stained black by exposure to the void, while the metal between was the color of dried blood. The Sword of Brass was accelerating. The death's grin of its hideous prow gaped wide enough to swallow the St. Aster whole. The battle was nearly over, but far from decided. There were 6 vessels of consequence in Strike Group St. Aster. The Vox Lexica floated with its engine stacks out, a dozen decks ablaze but void shields relit. The fleet carrier had been targeted early, but thanks to Athagay's foresight, most of its attack craft had been launched, and they played havoc with the enemy's lighter vessels, even while their carrier wallowed helplessly. The coming light and unmerciful had been pulled out of the fight, beating a slaughter-class cruiser down in a struggle of their own that had taken them tens of thousands of miles away from the St. Aster. Ars Bellus and Faith's Promise ran behind the flagship. They were light cruisers, the St. Aster's hunting dogs, and they chased their prey down, firing on the Red Gift as it closed on the St. Aster. Besides the capital vessels, there was the usual collection of fast escort vessels, destroyers and the like, but by that point in the battle, the squadrons had played their roles, and the outcome would be decided by the larger craft. The Sword of Brass's force had been smaller. One of its 3 supporting cruisers was already a cloud of atoms and spinning wreckage several thousand miles behind the St. Aster. Finula hoped the Red Gift would soon join its brother. Another round of hits from the Red Gift slammed into the St. Aster's flank. This time the voids were properly configured, took the violence and shunted it off into the warp. Purple lightning raced away from the site of the impact, momentarily obscuring the view forward. The hololith crackled as the augers feeding it were disrupted. "Where are our light cruisers?" Finula demanded of Lieutenant Basu, who oversaw the Master Augurum and his many control pits. "Coming in behind the Red Gift," said Basu. "They are gaining. Optimal close broadside range in 13 seconds. "Order them to draw level. Take it apart," Finula said. "Now!" A few seconds later, the void flashed with the sheet lightning of unseen explosions. "Ars Bellus reports Red Gift shields are out," said Lieutenant Gonan, the Vox liaison. "Faith's Promise is drawing into fire. It is breaking from pursuit. Have the light cruisers turn aside and finish it. Let the Commodore concentrate on Sword of Brass." Finula looked up at her mistress, who was fiercely concentrating. "A couple of prayers to the Emperor wouldn't go amiss either," she muttered. St. Aster and Sword of Brass were now racing at each other. The Sword of Brass opened fire as it closed, its skull guns blasting away at what was, in void terms, point-blank range. It was difficult not to flinch as shells big as buildings rushed at them, clearly visible to the naked eye. They detonated against the void shields and embraced the ship in flame. The explosion was sufficiently violent that the shields could not displace it all, and tank-sized chunks of shrapnel rattled from the armoured prow. "Excellent!" Athagay shouted excitedly. "As I expected. Their bloodlust betrays them. They've wasted their best chance at a kill shot." Her pale face was flushed, and her visible eye dilated with the stim she snorted so much of. "Engines all ahead full. Direct course for the Sword of Brass. Provoke those blood-worshipping heretics into doing something stupid." The St. Aster pushed through the short-lived cloud of flames, hurtling at its target with suicidal abandon. Goaded, the enemy ship responded in kind, and its rear flared with increased engine burn. Athagay spoke quickly, rattling off a series of orders to various sub-commanders. "Ready torpedoes, tight spread, directly for." Enginarium, prepare for full reverse. Directional thrusters, prep for engagement. Run out cannons, both batteries. Gunnery crews to stand ready to fire on my order alone. Fionnuala recognized the expression. The Commodore could smell victory. Fionnuala unconsciously reached for the railing around the command dais. Athagay had pulled her intended maneuver before, and as effective as it was, the results for the crew were unpleasant.
"Torpedoes ready,"
one of the lieutenants shouted. Wait for their next volley, then fire, Athagay commanded. Prime lancers to fire, batteries hold. Klaxons honked and acceptance chimes rang. Once more, the scull prow flashed. Emperor, strike us down, Fionnuala swore. They reloaded. Second volley inbound. The shields won't take that. Brace for impact, Fionnuala shouted. A press of a vox button sent her order across the ship. Alarm toxins blared, joining in the cacophony of weapons-ready alerts. Blast doors slammed closed all around the command bridge. The vessels were so close now that the shells crossed the space between them in a couple of seconds. Two detonated harmlessly on the shields. The third burst through the St. Asta's void envelope, dragging a corona of fading lightning behind it. The shell crashed into the ship's spine and exploded, tearing off one of the ship's massive lance turrets. The St. Asta shook hard, throwing Fionnuala about. The turret lifted on a trunk of fire and spun off, narrowly missing the command deck. The plough-blade prow of the St. Asta flashed as a full spread of torpedoes hauled themselves free of their tubes and accelerated towards the Sword of Brass. Debris from the lance turret crashed into the armour-glass oculars. A crack ran across one of the panes. "Close shutters!" Fionnuala shouted. "Belay that!" commanded Athagay. "Let's watch them burn! Lancers, fire now!" Columns of light burst from the ship's ventral turrets. There had been 6, 2 mounted atop each of the blocky gunnery decks on either side of the St. Asta's hull, and 2 more on the spine. 5 remained, angled so they would not hit those in front of them. At distance, their situation restricted the guns to firing at targets either side of the vessel, but on a closing enemy, more could be brought into arc, and 3 of the 5 energy beams slammed hard into the 4 portions of the Sword of Brass. Lancers were among the most powerful weaponry available to humanity, with high-output, long-burn beams. The Sword of Brass's void shields boiled with empiric energies as they took the hits, casting the Lancers' fury into the parallel dimension of the warp. But the Lancers continued to fire, stripping back the shields and overwhelming their generators, until the violent purple discharges bled away, became blue and feeble, and the shields faltered. Before the Lancers were forced to snap off, one punched through the failing voids and cut a new, molten smile across the face of the skull. In the cavernous halls providing power to the Lancers, frantic crews would be ejecting spent power cells, swapping out line feeds and recharging the coolant reservoirs. The lance turrets were hellish places. The gases the cannons vented to stop them overheating made the air unbreathable, and the crews were forced to work in heavy environment suits in temperatures close to the maximum the human body could endure. None of this was important on the command deck. The individual labors of thousands of human beings were insignificant. Only the collective result mattered. A cry went up. "Direct hit!" The crew cheered. The hit, though, was not Athagay's goal. "Torpedo contact imminent! Shield eyes!" Fionnuala commanded, and flipped down the photoreactive visor of her cap. The rest of the crew covered their faces with their hands and looked away from the oculus. The torpedoes shone brightly as reverse thrusters slowed them enough to pass through the enemy voids without tripping them. A moment later, they hit the Sword of Brass. Plasmic and thermonuclear warheads detonated on the hull, whiting out the forward view with painful light. "Now! Now! Now!" screamed Athagay. "While they're blind! Fire reverse thrusters! Fire maneuvering jets! Dive! Dive!" This was the part Fionnuala had been dreading. Nothing as big as the St. Asta could be brought to a dead stop quickly. They couldn't hope to slow it appreciably in such a short space to avoid impact if their course was wrong. She hoped Athagay had judged the distance well, and today was not the day she made her last mistake. Fionnuala felt the thrusters as a punch in her guts. The ship howled in protest. Integrity field projectors all over the vessel burst with strain, trying to hold it together. Metals screamed. On every deck, loose objects crashed forward, and men and women were flung about. The deceleration was only the beginning. The ship simultaneously dipped and went into a corkscrew. The Sword of Brass skimmed past within a few thousand yards, its blood-red hull filling the oculus from side to side. Proximity alarms shrieked with machine terror. They were close enough that the void shields of the St. Asta reacted with the residual energies shrouding the Sword of Brass in eerie phantasmic display, with eddies that looked uncomfortably like screaming faces. Athagay laughed. "Cut these motherless dogs," she shouted. "Show them the Emperor still rules this galaxy. Open fire!" As the St. Asta rolled, it opened fire with its port cannons. The shells punched into the belly of the Sword of Brass, tearing through pitted armor and into its interior spaces. There they detonated, ripping the underside of the vessel open. The St. Asta continued to spin as it dived, but it passed before the starboard batteries had rotated into position, much to Athagay's annoyance. "Too damn slow, laggards," she shouted. "When I command a double broadside, that is what I require." "It's dying, Madam Commodore. We need to get clear," Fionnuala said. She was sweating, her stomach doing somersaults. "Reactor is going into overload. Energy spikes across all auger frequencies. Shut the oculus and brace for debris impact," she said grimly. It was a phrase she had been forced to employ a great many times under Athagay's command. The Sword of Brass exploded as the great shutters were sliding closed. The reactor failed, and an orb of white fire as hot as a sun burst into life, sending searing slices of light across the command deck. Enough energetic discharge smashed into the rear of the St. Asta to rip it up, collapse the void shields, and make its 1,000 voices wail all over again. The ship shook violently before the explosion was off past them, gases and debris disappearing into the void. A last violent exhalation of a monster that had plagued the Imperium for millennia. Alarms were shut down, one by one. Teams from the Medicaid decks went to crew members. Fires were put out. Transmechanics raised electronic voices in prayer to placate the St. Asta's abused machine spirits, while their wrenches and arc torches tended to her physical hurts. Fionnuala ran a practiced eye over the multiple screens mounted on the railings. Data from every part of the ship scrolled past. "We were lucky. Again," she said. Commodore Athagay wasn't paying much attention to what was happening on the deck. With her fixed grin and flushed face, she seemed lost in post-combat ecstasy, but Fionnuala knew that wasn't all of it. Athagay would be in close contact with the rest of the strike group captains, sub-vocalizing her conversations through the vox beads embedded in her throat. Fionnuala watched her a moment. Her eyes were darting about. She had a retinal projector in her eyepiece that she habitually routed the hololith feeds through. Athagay had a tendency to paranoia and did what she could to keep her consultations private. The stim she took made it worse, but it hadn't become a problem. Yet. Fionnuala had her own work and was attending to it when Athagay suddenly stood up. In a rare, unguarded moment, she let concern show on her face. "Second Lieutenant Semaine, you have command. The enemy is done. I'm sure I can trust you with mopping up work. Lieutenant Diarmid, come with me into the dead end." She tugged off her taloned haptic glove and dropped it carelessly onto her throne, but left her eyepiece in place. Fionnuala shot her a questioning look. Athagay shook her head almost imperceptibly. "Later, then." Together they left the command dais. A pair of naval armsmen fell in behind them, and they made their way out of an armoured portal towards the command deck stateroom. On the bridge, the business of finishing off the heretic fleet continued smoothly, without the Commodore's input. They called the stateroom the dead end because there was only one way in. Even so, a pair of skulls tracked the two women with red-lensed eyes as they walked the short tunnel, rapid-fire laser carbines mounted over the door following them. Every one of the entrances to the command deck was covered by spirit-motivated weaponry. The dead-end stateroom was no exception. "Commodore Eloise Athagay," Athagay stated loudly at the circular door. Machine guardians heard and read her voice print. The door rolled aside, showing its thickness and the cog teeth that locked it in place. A scry skull floated down from its roost when they stepped through, and wordlessly swept them with its sensors. Only when that was done did the lumens activate. A fountain set into the back wall gurgled into action. A woman with an urn poured water into a bowl. She represented St. Asta herself, and a similar statue, many hundred times larger, adorned the figure plinth at the front of the superstructure. Fionnuala avoided looking at her. She found the statue's face bland, and its blank eyes always seemed to be judging her. "Shutters open," Athagay said. There was a tall window running the full length of the stateroom. External plasteel plates slid upwards at her voice command. High-grade machine spirits lurked in the workings of the rooms Athagay spent her time in, a favour called in from a grateful Archmagos, Fionnuala had heard, but the Commodore refused to comment on it. To an observer from a more civilized age, the contrast in technological levels on the St. Asta would have been confounding. To the two women, it was perfectly normal to have semi-intelligent devices performing menial tasks on one deck, while only a few hundred feet beneath them, work gangs hundreds strong labored to turn the starter wheels of world-killing weaponry by hand. "And you can be at ease now, Lieutenant Diarmid," Athergay added. Finula's manner suddenly changed. She dropped into a chair, tossed her hat onto the polished surface of the conference table, tugged her gloves off with her teeth, and leaned back, rubbing at her eyes with the heels of her hands. She sighed and let her hands drop into her lap. "What's happening, Eloise? It's not like you to miss the chance of hunting down a broken enemy personally." Athergay ignored her question. "Drink, Finula?" said the Commodore. She went to a cabinet built into the wall by the statue. "Now?" said Finula. She blinked blearily. "It's a bit early, isn't it?" "We've won the battle. We deserve to celebrate," Athergay said, looking up at the face of the water carrier. Its secretive fixed smile suggested she agreed. "St. Asta brought life by giving water to the thirsty, but I can do you better than water." Without waiting for a response from her second, Athergay pushed on the door. It was of real wood and opened without a sound. More lights inside illuminated the contents. Everything in the room was expertly made, spotlessly clean, an island of luxury in the oily body of the ship. Athergay took out 2 glasses and a decanter and set them down in front of Finula. She sat next to her instead of taking the captain's chair at the head of the table and poured. "To victory," said the Commodore, raising her glass. Finula lifted her glass and tapped it against Athergay's. The aroma of Nescotia's Distillarius Superior rose as her hand heated the drink. She hesitated before sipping. Every mouthful was worth more than she was. "I swear, every time you pull that trick, Eloise, the spine of this vessel gets 20 feet shorter. So does mine." "We won. I always do. And you're too tall anyway." Finula looked out of the window at the void. Intermittent flashes showed continuing weapons fire, but the battle was dying down. Strike fighters and bombers were returning to the ships. Debris flashed as it caught the steady starlight of the deep void, while far away, the dusty wheel of the Correvrekan Nebula, the principal feature of the Makota Sound, turned slowly on a background of uttermost black. The combined glow of young stars, gas, and the 60 established suns of the Sound around the Correvrekan outcompeted the starscape beyond, so the darker heart of the nebula seemed like a gate or a tunnel ringed with beacon lights. "We did win, and with your habitual verve, but every time I think it's the last, Emperor help me," said Finula. Athergay made a dismissive noise. "The Emperor's too busy to be paying any attention to us, my dear. And don't you go citing luck either. It was the right tactics for the right enemy. When one faces as belligerent a foe as blood worshippers, you have to use their aggression against them. Provoke them, and they make mistakes. They always do. I'd prefer a bombardment, stood off, if there had been heretic Astartes on those ships." "Bombardment at distance," said Athergay. "That's your answer to everything, Finula. Sometimes it will be the correct choice, sometimes it won't." She stuck out her bottom lip and spun her glass around on the polished table, leaving little rings of condensation. "You are right, to a degree. Our guns are better than theirs. Their warriors are more dangerous than ours, but one has to factor in the circumstances. We do not have time to play the distance game. These slaughter groups need putting down as soon as they are detected. If we are cautious, their ships will die, but then so will worlds as their comrades run amok unchallenged. We have to be quick. Right tactics, right enemy, right situation. One has to take risks in order to achieve the most favorable outcome." She downed her drink and slid the glass carelessly across the table. A minor adept's yearly stipend skidded dangerously close to destruction. Finula couldn't help follow it with her eyes. She was relieved when it came to a spinning stop. "What's going on?" she said. "You didn't bring me in here for a celebration, did you? There's something else." Eloise looked out of the window and frowned thoughtfully. "It is a little premature. I had a message, just now, delivered at priority from the Astro-Telepathicum. Communications are still bad, and they haven't finished the translation yet, but the gist is here." "It must have been important to bring it up before it was finished. What did it say?" said Finula. She put her own drink down, barely touched. "Well," Eloise said, nodding her head. That's the matter at hand, isn't it? We are to withdraw. Athergay took out a silver snuff tin, flipped it open, and pinched up a generous measure. She snorted it into both nostrils, then put it away. The habit was accomplished dexterously, with a minimum of movement, mostly single-handed. A hypnotic series of movements: draw, flip, pinch, snort, click, away. So businesslike, it seemed harmless, but after she'd partaken, her eyes shone a little too brightly, and their rims turned red. Fionnuala made a mental note. She had taken to recording how often Athergay took the stims. Confronting her about it without hard evidence was disastrous. She knew. She'd tried. The time was approaching for one of their difficult conversations. Athergay picked up Fionnuala's drink. Orders from Terra, via Fleet Command at Tasmar, in the Sound. At least messengers are getting through again, said Fionnuala. Maybe things are calming down after the blindness. I doubt that, said Athergay. Now listen to me. That's not all of it. There have been developments. Now Fionnuala was intrigued. Athergay was deliberately holding out on her, enjoying knowing something her lieutenant did not. Come on, Eloise, she said. Don't spin it out. Athergay sipped at Fionnuala's drink and gave her a mischievous smile. Get ready for this. There's quite a lot to take in. She paused dramatically. The Primarch, Rabute Gilliman, has miraculously returned to life and come to Terra. What? Said Fionnuala. She went rigid with surprise. Hang on, there's more, Athergay said, enjoying Fionnuala's reaction. He's been appointed Lord Commander. They're calling him the Regent of the Imperium. There's been a purge of the High Lords. We're to rejoin the body of our fleet, aid in evacuating all military assets from this war zone. We're abandoning everything on the far side of the Corryvreckan, regrouping on this side of the Sound, then falling back to the fortress world of Hydrafor. Then what? We're to await further orders. The Admiral might know a bit more. A Primarch? Fionnuala shook her head. How can this possibly be true? Is it true? She said. It was hard to falsify astropathic messages, as the sender's intent was often clearer than the message itself, but it wasn't impossible. The message is triple Aquila secure, sent by the purest, most powerful astropaths in the fleet. It is genuine. But why? We're going to lose everything we fought for since the rift opened. The Crusade of Slaughter is attacking every world around the Sound. We can't just abandon them, said Fionnuala. We're doing it because we've been told to, and... She smiled. He's called a new crusade, in the Emperor's name. He's been on Terra several months already, apparently. There was an attack on the throne world, which he drove off. Then he announced this Indomitus crusade. Preparations are well underway. A lot has happened. She tipped her glass at Fionnuala. So communications aren't that good after all, are they? A crusade? Now? We've not enough warriors and ships to hold what we have. After an attack on Terra itself. That's insanity. Is that true? Said Athergay. Fionnuala hated it when she asked rhetorical questions. Think about it, my dear Fionnuala. What is the point of frittering away the Imperium's strength on worlds we've already lost, when those forces could be better used combined? Spread thin, our armies are next to useless. Combined, they will be unstoppable. It doesn't take a Primarch to see that, though it does take one to order it. We'll lose a bit of ground, then we'll take it all back, then more besides. These are great days. Athergay stood and downed the rest of Fionnuala's drink. The small problem of the evacuation remains, of course. Where, I wonder? She looked out of the window at the dust cloud, the suns, and the darkness at the cloud's heart that promised the birth of more. I'll wager my rank that we'll be sent to Fomor 3 once Treheskon gets in touch. Fomor seems like the best place to gather everything together. She shrugged. We'll see. Wherever we're ordered, we've avoided the central Makorta conflict zone for a while, hunting down these reaving parties. Now we're to sail right into the mouth of hell. So be it. We'll do our part and be away. Not even Horus, nor any of his devils could stop us. Athergay smiled. Fionnuala frowned. The difference in their expressions summed up the divergence in their characters perfectly. For Athergay, it was about the glory. Fionnuala approached their missions with both eyes fixed on survival. That's why they were a good match. We need to get ready, the Commodore said. This has to be done properly. Hat on, gloves on, back straight. No more Eloise for a little while. I'm going to call the rest of the watch command in here. Tell them. I expect you to look suitably serious. Then we'll wait for all of the teleprayer to be decoded in full before announcing it to the strike group. That should provide a nice little morale boost. We've got to get the Vox Lexica sailing again and regroup our flotilla. Her speech raced to keep up with her mind, both fueled by the stims. Better get the bloody priests up here too. We're going to have to do the whole damn show.
Chapter 7. Priority Ultima. Scribum Processus. Overwatcher Jedmund. Nora Nissen's workspace was confined in a cubicle exactly 16 feet square. The walls extended up further than she could reach, high enough to screen her from her thousands of fellows and most of the soft, whispery noises their turning of pages created, but open at the top, exposing her to the scrutiny of the supervisor servo skulls that swept by periodically. Despite that, she could not see the ceiling. She never had. It was lost in the blackness. Her cubicle and all the others were each provided with a single lumen lamp on a flexible arm, and their light was barely adequate to illuminate the small desks. The remaining furnishings and fixtures of the cubicle comprised a small voxmeter built into the wall covered with a heavy bronze grille, a broad slot in the outer cubicle wall to accept incoming missives for appraisal, a number of deep shelves mounted close together, and a chair so ancient its uncomfortable metal seat had been worn wafer-thin by generations of worthy fundaments. Nora spent her days in the cubicle and her nights in the dormitory. There were rigorously timetabled visits to the ablatorials and refectory, once-monthly visits to the facility chapel, twice-yearly visits to the bathhouse, and occasional much-feared moments in the Overwatcher's office. But the dormitory and the cubicle were where the majority of her time was spent, and the cubicle took the greater share. Her only personal possession was the worn Empress tarot deck neatly stacked at the left of her desk, close enough for her to brush with her fingers for comfort, but out of the way of her work. Her shifts were 11 hours long. She was 4.5 hours into the current one. Every 90 minutes, new documents were delivered for her to process. Right on time, the squeaking wheels of a cart approached down the corridor. Sometimes she could hear the adept moving around on the other side of the cubicle wall, and the rustle of papers as her next workload was portioned out. This time she heard nothing. A thick stack of papers burst through the delivery slot, making her jump, though she expected it. She grasped the stack. Through the soft vellum, she felt the presence of another human being. Her heart quickened. Her mind raced with thoughts of who they might be, what they might look like, and how many times they'd shared these fleeting moments, the only instances of human contact she had throughout the day. The adept let go of the papers suddenly. In her excitement, Nora had been gripping them hard, and she lurched a little with their release. As a result, the vellum came out of the slot too quickly. Although only a dozen sheets thick, vellum was heavy, and the end fell onto her desk with a thump. It hit her tarot deck, knocking it onto the floor. As they fell, several of the cards fluttered loose, the rest exploding in all directions when they hit the tiles, whispering on cushions of air to each corner of her cubicle. She reached down, praying softly under her breath as she gathered them up. Every second wasted would be punished if she was seen. She finished the task quickly, piling the cards as she gathered them, then sat up. The pages had spread themselves in a fan on the desk, close to slipping onto the floor after the cards. The onion skin papers that protected each and concealed the contents were in disarray. These minor disasters upset her, and she prayed faster as she rearranged them. She tried to preserve the stack, fearful of upsetting its emperor-ordained order. While doing so, she lifted half the pile to pat it into shape. What she saw beneath had her stop in disbelief. Somehow, 5 of her cards had worked their way into the pile and now sat on top of one of the missives in a perfect Aquilan reading. 3 cards upright, close together, made the body of the imperial eagle. 2 further horizontal cards made its wings. She gaped. She couldn't have laid the cards out more neatly herself. What was more, the onion skin cover on the missive was rumpled up into nothing. The cards covered the body of the message, except for a few words visible between the gaps. One sentence fragment leapt out at her. "Attention of the Lord Commander himself." She looked at the cards for the first time. 2 were major arcana, 2 more from the Discordia suite. Only 1 was a minor suite. The big 4 were cards that rarely came up in the readings she did for her own guidance. She had drawn them, singly, very occasionally, but never so many important cards in one spread. The Emperor's throne sat in the middle. The engines of war reversed was to its left. The shattered world, also reversed, was to the right. The right wing of the Aquila was Guilliman's wrath,
with the top of the card facing away from the center. The galaxy made the other wing, and the upper portion of this card pointed towards the middle three. Her eyes ran over the spread, trying to decide what it meant. Before she knew what she was doing, she had pressed the single red button beneath the voxmeter. A light inside flickered at her, balefully. The Vox unit connected to the archives department, who provided research so the missives could be properly classified. But it did have other uses. "Auditorium recruiter," she said clearly. The voxmeter buzzed, and the light clicked off. Seconds later, a servo skull swooped down over her cubicle, dazzling her with brilliant white light from a side-mounted search lumen. "Scribe processors Nissan, state problem." A machine snarl served the skull as a voice. Its eyes flashed in time with its words. "I need to see Overwatcher Jedmond," she said. She pointed to the tarot spread atop the missive. The skull angled downwards, turned on its axis as it examined the cards. The voxmeter bolted into the wall coughed. "What is it this time, Nissan?" Jedmond's irritation hissed out on a tide of static. "I need to see you, Adept," she said humbly, bowing so the skull could see, and pointed once more to the spread. Jedmond said nothing for a few seconds. The voxmeter hissed. "To me, Scribum," he said wearily. "Now." The locks of her door clunked. The nerve-shredding sound of metal squealing on metal reverberated across the cubicularium as it swung open. All at once, the soft sounds of quills, turning pages, and collective, barely heard breathing stopped as everyone within earshot strained to listen. She stepped out. The door closed behind her, just as noisily. The soft sounds of scribes at work returned, perhaps a little more hurried. Every second lost added to their weight of sin. "Follow," the skull said. It bobbed down in front of her, lighting the dark corridor with its search beam. The cubicles were arranged in rectangular blocks of 16, 2 deep and 8 long. The corridors between them formed a grid pattern of maddening, soulless precision that stretched away into the darkness. Hundreds of doors lined the ways. Nora's slippered feet padded silently on the tile floor, but the skull's grav impeller warbled loudly, making her self-conscious. In every one of the small cubicles would be a man or a woman wondering what was going on. She could almost feel their thoughts. So many thinking the same thing was oppressive, although she knew it was only her imagination. She muttered prayers of apology under her breath, and made sure to genuflect at every shrine they passed on the way. There were mounting brackets for lumen panels on the walls, and candelabra depended from the distant ceiling on long chains, but nearly all were either empty or the fittings they had were dead. When she did pass a working panel, or see a lumen tree with a single working bulb, she felt exposed to view. Although she was aware enough of the way the world worked to know she was always being watched, the patches of light made it all the worse, and she scooted past them quickly. When she did, the skull bobbed around and flew backwards and watched her with a quizzical air. She averted her eyes from the glaring lenses buried in its eye sockets. 15 minutes of walking brought the hall wall into view. 10 more had her climbing a mountain of steps. After 3 turns, she was struggling. She was in poor physical health, and she stopped to catch her breath on a landing. The rail she leaned against wobbled. Moisture ran mouldy streaks down the wall behind her. The cubicularium stretched out forever beneath her. The soft glow of the scribe's lamp shone upwards in faint shafts of light that the dark rapidly swallowed. In places, whole sections were dark, but most contained workers locked in their cells, just like her. People she had worked alongside all her life, but of whose names she knew only a handful. She was high enough up to see into those beneath the stairs, and she found herself staring at the tops of heads bent over piles of missive vellum, evaluating cries for help from every corner of mankind's interstellar realm. She had seen nothing of the stars, only the missives. As far as she was concerned, the Imperium was an empire of words alone. It might not exist at all. The skull floated back down the stairs and hovered in front of her face. "Do not dally. Follow." She drew in a painful breath and recommenced her climb. Overwatcher Jedmond was a short, balding man with bad skin and black teeth. He gave the impression of corpulence without actually being fat. Nobody in the missive hall was fat, not even those in charge. To Nora, his small office was a land of unimaginable luxury. He had at least 3 servants who bustled about, pulling scrolls from the pigeonholes that lined the walls and stacking data slates in special wheeled racks. There was a window looking down over the cubicle field. A door she had never seen open led out from the back. What was through there? She imagined an ablatorial, so close to hand he could use it whenever he wanted, or his own personal habdorm where he slept in splendid solitude upon a soft bed. The idea that there could be several private rooms and access to corridors that led out of the missive hive had not crossed her mind. Such things were beyond her frame of reference. Jedmund huffed and sniffed as he read and reread the missive. "It is a simple Ultima request like the hundreds of others we receive every day. Process it. Submit archive searches for terms you do not comprehend. Stamp it. Put it in the right tray." "But the cards," she said. She felt stupid now she was in front of Jedmund. "Hundreds," he said, eyes narrowed. "Every day." He put the missive down on his oversized desk. It was almost as big as her cubicle, so huge a piece of furniture it made him look bizarre, like a little decorative cherub that had come to life and crept off its plinth to take up work in the world of men. "Do you actually know what these words mean?" he said, waving his hand over it. "Of course you don't. You have your checklist. Your role, Scribum, is to evaluate these threat missives according to the departmento criteria. There are the seals, the cogitatorial marks, the adept pass signs, the significant term colours." He gestured at all these things in turn. "Others have done their work. Yours is to look at that and to rank it accordingly and pass it on. You're supposed to read them only in exceptional circumstances because you don't understand what they say. That is all right, because you are not supposed to understand." He gave her a cruel smile. "You are supposed to process." He was right. She didn't understand. "But the cards," she said. "It was a perfect spread. I could have laid it out myself." "You dropped them. You said so. Imagination is the assassin of good sense. Do not think. It is bad for you." "The spread was all of portentous cards. What happens if... She swallowed and dropped her voice. "What happens if he is trying to guide us? The cards are the Emperor's way of speaking with us. Everyone knows that. The priests say..." "Please," he interrupted, with an admonishing look. "Why would he be putting thoughts into a head like yours? You're nobody. That's not how the tarot works." "Do you know how it works?" "I have my own," he said, patting a box made of actual wood. He flipped the lid. A set of 12 crystal flex cards were held inside in velvet-lined slots, so much grander than her worn set of peeling cardboard. Seeing something so wildly expensive made her feel worthless. "You must be devout to possess such a thing," she said, ashamed. She dropped her eyes. Her fingers were wrestling with themselves at the front of her dirty robes. She didn't want her fingers to do that, but getting them to stop was an effort. "I consult it every day," he said proudly. "Today they didn't tell me anything special was going to happen." He sighed and thought, and looked at the missive again. "Did you pray before making the spread?" "No, I didn't make the spread. It made itself." "You formed no question in your mind?" "No, they fell without preparation." "So you do not know what it means?" His fingers rested on the vellum, the fate of worlds under an insignificant hand. "No, I do not." "Then why would the God Emperor do that? He does not set out to confuse us. I have a mind to report you to Shriver Leonard for this heresy." She looked up sharply. "No, please." A visit to Shriver Leonard was the worst thing in her tiny world. He held up his hand. "I'm not going to. It's a happenstance, Nissen. You dropped your cards. I admire your honesty about your clumsiness. You will be docked half an hour of sleep rotation for the next 5 circulations. More work will help you focus your mind. Pray to the Emperor and thank him for guiding me towards forgiveness. In his light, I am merciful." She should have been thankful, but her eyes strayed back to the missive. Her foreboding grew every time she looked at it. "Overwatcher." "Be pleased I do not add more," said Jedmund curtly. "By the time you are back at your desk, you will be a full 1,000th behind your work. You have wasted a great deal of time. Now, be back about your business." He held out the missive to her with a sympathetic expression. "Process it with the others. I know it looks bad, but since the blindness passed, more and more missives like this have arrived. I see many far worse than this every week. Emperor preserve us all. The numbers are unprecedented. The Imperium is on fire. A lot of those are addressed to the sainted Primarch.
How do you think he would react if every scribum and petty person bothered him with their woes? He is concerned with the fates of sectors. We cannot trouble him with the tears of single worlds. But I read them all, and I understand them, Scribum Nissen. How do you think that makes me feel? Very bad? Worse than that, he said gravely, and it wasn't all for show. Yes, Overwatcher, I'm sorry. If this really is as important as you fear, then the Emperor will make sure it gets to the right place. That is our purpose. It is not through individuals that the God Emperor exerts his will, but through the bureaucracy of the Adeptus Administratum, his most holy machine, of which you and I are only a tiny part. One human effort is nothing, but together we are the greatest empire there has ever been. Be reassured that your insignificant toil here aggregates with that of billions of others into something fine and mighty. In that way we serve, though we are but humble. Yes, Overwatcher. Have faith, Scribum Processus Nissen. While the Emperor watches over us from his golden throne, nothing can go amiss. Nora took the missive back. Overwatcher Jedmond took up a large quill and returned to his own work, perusing a long tabulated list and ticking boxes down its left margin, seemingly at random. She didn't move. That will be all, he said, without looking up. He gestured with his free hand to one of his servants, who took Nora by the elbow and steered her out. His touch was soft, but his scowl was hard. Outside, the skull was waiting to lead her back down the stairs to her cell. Chapter 8. 60 Suns. Warp Rift. Hounds of Corn. The St. Aster lurched through the storms ripping through the warp. No voyage had been smooth since the rift had torn the galaxy asunder. 3 ships from Athagay's flotilla had foundered in the last few months, but it did not appear to daunt the Commodore. Rather, she exulted in the power of the storm. She had a light in her eyes that both inspired and worried Fionnuala. Klaxons blared all around the command deck. The great bell of the watch hanging from the apex of the deck's dome was released to begin its somber ringing. The first hole rolled out a forbidding peal that shook the bones of the crew. "All hands prepare for real space translation," the master of the Empyrean intoned from his pulpit. He wore a ritual blindfold as part of his robes of office and shouted through a voxmeter sutured to his lips. A choir 50 strong repeated his words. Vox thieves carried by servo skulls relayed the song to the entire ship. A contingent of the ship's priests added their voices, swelling the announcement with plain song. Incense hung over everything. The bell reached the apogee of its ponderous swing, hung a moment, then returned. The clapper met the metal, and the bell tolled again. "Vox Lexica, Coming Light, Unmerciful, Ars Bellus, and Faith's Promise all report readiness for simultaneous warp breach, Commodore," a fleet liaison officer reported. "Squadrons Perseverant, Exultant, Fulminant, and Excoriant likewise report readiness." Athagay stared at the armoured shutters covering the oculus, as if she could see through them into the tides of the Empyrean. "Ship-wide Vox," Athagay commanded. A device fashioned as a pair of angels fluttered down on noisy wings. The grav impeller that kept them aloft buzzed. A mechanical arm unfolded and held out a Vox horn to the Commodore's lips. She paused a moment to formulate her words, then spoke firmly. "Heed me now, brave voidsmen and women of the Imperium," she said. "We sail directly into the mouth of hell itself. On the other side of the veil, a horde of heretics and traitors wait to bar our way to Fomor 3, where thousands of the Emperor's loyal servants await rescue. There are warriors, a thoughts bred from us, who fought with the arch-traitor Horus at the time of the Imperium's triumph. They do not know they lost their war. We are going to educate them." She stood from her throne. The angels beat their decorative wings. The grav impeller hummed loudly, and the device floated up to follow her. "On Terra, at this moment, a wonder has occurred. The Primarch Rabute Gilliman has returned to us. The Emperor has shown us that he will not submit to his ancient foes. The future is being remade as we speak. The Imperium will endure. It is our great glory to serve the Emperor and his last surviving son, to begin this era that will see the greatness of our species restored. Many of us will die. Fear not. The Emperor awaits all who serve him faithfully and who give all of themselves unto him. Monsters wait for us, but not a single one of them cannot be vanquished by the sword of faith.
To arms! To arms! She nodded to her chief warbringers, the masters of ordnance, torpedoes, lance, attack craft, and plasma. Run out the guns! Increase reactor output to maximum. Begin real space engine initiation. We enter the materium fighting ready, and we will not cease the spilling of blood until our mission is accomplished and the brave soldiers of the Emperor are retrieved, so that they too might better serve our beloved God Emperor. She sat down to resounding cheers. Fionnuala looked up to her mistress, taking her eyes only briefly from the myriad tasks she must oversee. That was a good speech. Aren't they all? Said Athagay. To the matter of battle, if Admiral Trehexon's reports are still accurate, the enemy will be waiting for us at the Mandeville Point. There are a few safe egresses in the Sound, and only one in the Fomor system. We are ready for them. Bold heart, Fionnuala, bold heart. A violet light blinked on Athagay's armrest. All hands, she shouted. We begin translation now. Transmit orders to the flotilla. Exit is 5, 4, 3... The bell clanged. The ship groaned. The whole deck shook. Cold foxfires gathered around the sharp edges of command stations and in the eyes of the skulls staring out from the capitals of columns. The command deck crew strapped themselves in. Those with the facility to do so maglocked themselves to the deck. Armsmen returned to their shock cradles. The priests sang their hymns louder, competing with the howling squeal of the warp engines now reverberating down the length of the St. Aster. 2, 1. Translate now. Engage real space engines. All hands, prepare for battle. The ship shuddered. Fionnuala held on tight. Her vision blurred. The outlines of her fellow officers broke into overlapping images of different colours, smearing themselves out on the membrane dividing reality from unreality. With a rising wail, the St. Aster broke warp and powered into the materium. Only the navigators could look out into the Empyrean safely. The rest felt their arrival through the vessel's violent shaking. Translation successful, the Master of Displacement said. All ships reporting in. Full flotilla emergence. Praise be to the Golden Throne. Open the oculus, commanded Athagay. Raise shields. Plasteel slabs drew back from the armour glass, uncovering a breathtaking vista. Colours of rare beauty saturated the void of the Makorta Sound. The Corre Vrecken pulsed hungrily at the centre. Plasmic discharges flashed through the dense cloud banks where the seeds of stars were sown. Around the periphery burned young suns that made up the shores of the Sound, wreathed by the trailing disks of planetary formation. Claws of dust and glowing gas extended in all directions from the Corre Vrecken cloud, their tips adorned by stellar ignition. Though all the worlds about the stars of the Sound were young, they were rich with elements forged in the pulsing heart of the nebula, and many already bore life. All these had been eagerly claimed by the Imperium. For 6,000 years they had formed a prosperous group of mutually dependent states. Now there was not a single one untouched by war. Fomor was Strike Group St. Aster's destination, a large main sequence star of gentle yellow hue, the kind most suited to life-bearing worlds. Fomor had 3 around its ample waist. All were to be abandoned to the crusade of slaughter. Streamers of corpuscent and ghost lights washed off the St. Aster's prow, obscuring some details of the view. These dissipated rapidly, and Fionnuala caught sight of the Ars Bellus and the Unmerciful riding a little ahead. Finding themselves behind, their escorts pushed forward to take up lead positions, their wakes marked by the annihilation sparkle of cosmic debris caught on void shields. It was virtually impossible to bring a fleet out of the warp in battle formation, especially in an environment as gravitically dense as the Sound. But Athagay nodded in satisfaction at what she saw. Fionnuala raced through a dozen screens of information. The fleet was in good order and would quickly be in a workable fighting stance. The St. Aster shields ignited a moment later, flexing the view of the stars and nebula with temporary distortion. A passable response time, though not fast enough for Athagay. She would have to address that. Put fleet disposition on the main hololith, Fionnuala ordered her subordinates. Begin broad auger sweep, full spherical soak, 10,000-mile radius, then in further increments of 10,000 out to 100,000 miles. Already, information from the ship's sensoria was pouring in. Weapons discharge, recent warp exits and plasma trail returns brought evidence of high activity in the system. Guided by the sensor returns, the naked eye could pick out the signs of the war. Fomor's void space flashed with the light of battles fought hours before. The intensity of them and their persistence suggested Fomor's worlds were hotly contested. They picked up thousands of Vox messages. None were meant for the St. Asta. It would be hours before they were noticed, then hours more before the first messages intended for the Commodore reached the system's edge. But they gave the vessel Strategos more information with which to build a tactical picture. "All ships into formation. Match Vox Lexica's speed. We make for Fomor 3, said Athagay. "Where?" the Master of the Seers called. "The Psi Augury brings unusual readings from a source near our destination." It always amazed Fionnuala how Athagay could seize upon the most pertinent piece of information among the torrents coming at her, but she heard and responded. "Show me." At the Master of Seers' command, a section of the Oculus was reproduced on one of the major Tri-D projectors. The yellow arc of Fomor was amplified. Fomor 3 was on the far side, but there was a plume of some energy that protruded over the rim of the sun. "What is that?" asked Athagay. "According to my readings, my lady, it is a warp rift, and it is growing, spreading out from Fomor 2 in the direction of Fomor 3. Athagay said. She rose from her seat and walked down to stand by Fionnuala. She was jittery. She had that sharp smell that came from stim withdrawal, a desperate reek. She fumbled for her tin. An alarm rang from another quarter of the deck, followed by several more. "My lady, Squadron Perseverant reports inbound flight of enemy destroyers 5 Dragon class," another officer informed her. "Unresolved energy signatures following behind. Cogitators suggest 3 cruisers of mid-gravitic displacement." "The Hounds of Khorne have our scent," Athagay said. The information was pushed onto another screen. By then, the bridge's apse was filled with glowing hololiths and flat projections, as layered and complex as the dust clouds of the nebula. Athagay examined the predicted trajectory of their interceptors. "Then our mystery phenomenon will have to wait," she said. "We need to take care of this. I'll not run before an enemy, only to have them close aft when we slow to join the battle at Fomor 3. Bring us down in speed. Begin manoeuvres to form gunline and begin perpendicular traversal to line of enemy approach. Vox Lexica, prepare bomber assault. Tell Captain Ladinmock to hang back. His ship's still hurting. We'll stop this before it begins, but we need the bombers in the void now." Alarms howled. The ship moaned as engines fought inertia to push it around. "This is only the first skirmish," Athagay said quietly to Fionnuala. "Fomor is going to be a hard fight." Fionnuala was only half listening. Her eyes were on the painful smear of the warp rift coming around the sun. Chapter 9. A Changing Career. Logister Gunther. Avenging Sun. Dinner in the Grand Senatio was a formal affair. It was not accounted for in the adepts' thin allotment of free time, but regarded as part of their work.